Applications run nearly every aspect of your business and our world, making trillions of connections easier, but also more vulnerable to attack. Our global platform gives us unmatched visibility into threats and how they change, intelligence we use to tune your defenses and protect every application that runs your business every day. Learn more at akamai.com/security.
All right, good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing? Great, great, thank you so much. So first of all, I really appreciate you had some choices, right? To sleep in, do breakfast, think about sleeping in, doing breakfast, and joining me here. So thank you again, thank you so much. 8:30 in the morning is a tough one. I'm gonna do my best for the next 45 minutes to have a very engaging conversation on what's happening with the APIs, right? You kind of talk about them, you hear about them, and we've done a lot of research and we've looked at, how are enterprises dealing with it and what's happening under the hood, under the covers. And we know that we live in an ever-connected digital economy, right? Everything that we do is connected, and a lot of these applications are utilizing APIs as a method of communications, as a method of B2B, B2C, user to the app, app to the user, machine to machine, endless combinations and permutations, right? So we're going to double click and see what the latest data shows us with what's happening in the world of APIs, right? A little bit of a disclosure, don't go buy stock or anything like that, right? APIs are everywhere, right? Literally everywhere. You get up in the morning, you do something, somewhere, somehow, you're connecting some API, and it is across the entire landscape, right? It's in the social media, it's in the B2B, in the commerce, in the telecommunications networks, in payment systems, in banking, in any kind of fun activities that you're doing, entertainment, gaming, etc. And again, going back to we live in this hyper-connected digital economy, which is creating all of this information flows, and majority of those information flows are utilizing APIs, right? So maybe a very trivial one, but everybody knows what APIs are, right? So I'm going to skip that. Thank you. Yeah, I love it when few people show up the hand, and the others, by the time they realize what I'm asking, let it go. So thank you. So when you came up in the morning and said, hey, I'm going to go do the RSA conference, right? So you probably booked your travel, you booked your hotel, you figured out where you're going to go eat, you figured out what you're going to post on social media, etc. You check the weather, what's it going to be in San Francisco, etc. So when you think about all of these transactions that you did, they were all beneath all of that. There was some API interaction taking place, right? And when these API interactions are taking place, when you want to know the weather in San Francisco, it's pulling a lot of data from so many different places. When you went and said, hey, I want to get to this restaurant and I want to go check the rating of the restaurant, it was pulling information. And a lot of these interactions then are sort of traversing over Akamai's network, Akamai's edge, Akamai's infrastructure. And that is when we start to take a look at it and say, hey, this is how we are seeing the attackers, and we are seeing the normal traffic. We are seeing what the users are doing, what the machines are doing. But by the same token, we have visibility on what the attackers, the adversaries are doing, right? With those same APIs that you as an enterprise, as a customer, as a business is trying to utilize it to serve the purposes that we are just discussing over here, right? So think about just the sheer amount of interactions that are powered by APIs, and then underneath that, what is the data telling us? And I'm going to go double click on what is the data telling us, right? So the data is telling us that 1/3, 30% or 29% of the web attacks last year we looked at 12 months where sort of, web attacks were targeted APIs. So the attackers have kind of found this new threat landscape and said, hey, there are a lot of enterprises that are not doing a good job of protection, posture management, discovery. Let me go kind of figure it out. And in my presentation, I will go into some examples, right? Whether it's a carding attack or a loyalty program abuse or a business logic or how the adversaries are coming in and attacking and utilizing this information and what do you need to do about it, right? But 29% is an astonishing number. And then you see all the headlines, right? So you probably saw last year, the big headline around T-Mobile, Twitter, Zendex. I mean, the list goes on, and there are a bunch of them over here too that hackers were able to expose, what's that number, 26 million, So you kind of see there is some level of data breaches happening, data extraction, some, monetizable value, whether it's a loyalty plan, some kind of a break into accounts and taking over accounts, some kind of a utilizing APIs for, carding attacks. So the bad guys are after so many different things, right? And depending upon the type of business. And if you think about what's happening in healthcare, right? So we are all going to be experiencing sort of, aging in place or this ever-connected healthcare. And all of that information is now sort of, subject to abuse, subject to sort of, taking that information away or even doing things that is malicious. And ultimately, you think about what's happening with ransomware, you think about what's happening with just, cyber resilience. Very, very important that you take a look at these headlines, what was happened. There's a lot of forensics that goes in, and start to think about, what do we do about it, right? So I'll share some data. This is from the SOTI report that we published, which is the State of the Internet report, 10 years celebrating the SOTI reports, and we are kind of double-clicking on what happened with 12-month period last year for APIs, right? So the first data over here is that, hey, EMEA has the highest percentage of API attacks on a global basis, right? Almost 47%, 50%. This is big, right? Why? And you could say maybe there's a geopolitical issue, right? That's what's going on over there. And yes, that is true because there are a number of different sort of, wars taking place in that region. So it's kind of natural to see some of the data correlate to what is happening on the ground. But then you go and say, okay, you got North America, you have, other regions that are experiencing this thing too. So somewhat of a sort of, topical information, but what this tells me is that, it's happening across the world, right? It's not localized to North America or EMEA, it's happening across the world. The more and more the economies are connected digitally, the more attacks you will see, right? So some of that is reflected in the data too over here, if you can think about. So what's the trend and the scores, with the APIs, right? In terms of types of industries. So it's kind of hard to read maybe, but commerce is at the top, which is, hey, I'm doing all of these, different interactions, whether I'm, again, going back to my example, when you decided to come to RSA, you booked a flight, you booked a hotel, you booked some other things that you needed over here. So all of that commerce that is taking place is going back and forth, utilizing tremendous amount of sort of, APIs, right? When you go do a search on what is the cheapest flight or what's the, best hotel from a price or amenities perspective, there's all these aggregation, all of this information are being scraped and put together, and those are the transactions then, the bad guys are figuring out how to go penetrate. A lot of the API attackers are utilizing sort of, mini bots or bots to go do some of these things, right? So you start to, again, look at the types of industries, and I'm sure you can see financial services over there, business services over there. So not a surprise, right? Everything that we expect and anticipate, that is what is happening over here again and again and again. And the whole point is that public sector, right? Even public sector is right there, right? So if you have, kids in the school district, if you have government agencies that you're dealing with, we hopefully, I won't do a show of hands, but most of us, filed our taxes, right? And those are all API transactions, right? So as you can imagine, what's happening with the government agencies and how they're doing it. Moving us along, hey, what are the techniques, right? So there is a OWASP top 10 API list. So it's published by the organization, but it goes beyond the top 10. As you can see, the adversaries are predominantly, using some of the tried and true methods of infiltrating their targets, right? Clearly, we see the HTTP, we see some of the JSON attacks, we see some stuffing going on, et cetera, and you start to see that long tail, right? So that tells me that they are utilizing different methods for different areas, right, on how they go about the penetration, the extraction of the data, the abuse of the logic, and finding some kind of, value for them, right? So a lot of good information, a lot of good data. When you start to sort of summarize and say, hey, what are the most common problems that we see, right? We see problems with posture. And what does that mean? So we see a lot of enterprises not having a good handle on, we call them the shadow APIs, right? Because these APIs have been developed, launched, there was probably a purpose. Now the things have changed, you have upgraded your platform, you have moved from A to B, B to C, C to D, and you left behind all of those things and never cleaned it up. So those APIs are out there and they become the targets because nobody's making sure that there are no vulnerabilities or all the authentication is tight, et cetera. We see a lot of unauthenticated resource access. We see a lot of sensitive data in URL, right? So still today, developers are utilizing whatever methods that they are comfortable with passing, PII data and other data. And these are the ways, again, to kind of do the extraction, break it. And a lot of times it's a little bit of a trial and error, right? The bad guys are going to try and say, okay, was I able to get the last name? Okay. Was I able to get the account number? Okay. Was I able to get the last four social, right? So they keep trying multiple routes, and then once they get the full package of information, now they go about and figuring out a more systematic way of going and attacking that API the next day or 3 days later and saying, okay, now can I extract the full information? And when I talk about some examples, I'll do that, excessive client errors, another, area. But you get the point, right? Posture is a problem, so we got to do some work collectively on that. And then you have runtime. So what's happening in runtime, right? So in runtime, a lot of, abnormal JSON properties. You have the path parameters are fuzzy. The other thing that I still find interesting is we see this impossible time travel. What is impossible time travel? Which is, hey, there was this user who logged into the loyalty program from the United States, and then maybe in 5 minutes later, that same loyalty account was kind of penetrated or account was entered from Asia, right? And you start to look at, okay, what's happening? Because this was from that device, from that mobile device, it was authenticated, it was entered, and now the second attempt is coming from a different place. So you look at what's happening with the impossible time travel, you put the things together, and then you see the pattern on what the bad guys are doing. A lot of data scraping, right? Some of the data scraping is good, right? Again, my example of we all want to know what is the cheapest flight to San Francisco. That's a bunch of scraping, that's good scraping, but when the bad guys are going and scanning pricing or other things and they're scraping it or they're going after the inventory and scraping that, a lot of that is turned into abuse, right? APIs are utilized for that. So let's talk about the most common problems. We looked at the data, we looked at some of the trends. I feel like we're at a place where visibility is ever more important, right? It's like the whole cyber resilience starts with this discovery and visibility, and do we know about it, right? So how many, show of hands, for real, like how many folks have full view of all the APIs in your enterprise? Right? I see no show of hands and some heads nodding saying, nope, we don't, right? Because it would be hard for us to stand up and say, hey, I know everything. So visibility is such an important thing. And you repeatedly ask the question, how do I get that, right? Can I get it from the runtime? Can I go shift left? Can I get it in my pipeline? Can I go and send a memo from the CIO, CISO, CEO to the whole development teams and say, hey, here's a spreadsheet, go fill out a form that says these are the APIs I know about, right? Do you do self-attestation, right? No, you can't, right? You gotta have software that is figuring all of these things out because that's the world we live in. So A lot of focus on visibility is very, very important. So if you take away a few things from my sort of presentation today, you think about how do you do discovery and visibility. That's your first step, right? Vulnerabilities, knowing what's out there, the best practices for deployment, et cetera. And I think the industry as a whole is doing a lot of good work in this space, right? So I'll give you two examples. So one is, I think there is a lot of, sharing happening on the good side of cybersecurity, right? So there's a lot of, ways where people are communicating, the 0-day are becoming, how should I say it? But, just the community coming together, the responses are a lot more faster, that information sharing and then kind of building the guard. So that's a good thing. The second thing that is happening is a lot of good focus on this concept of shift left, right? Which is saying that, can I go deeper into the development process? Can I go to the developer and say, hey, let me go do your API testing, let me go do them scanning, because I already know from my runtime experience that this would create a BOLA attack, or this would create an authentication error, or this could create some kind of an abuse logic. And if I told you all of that information and you fixed it prior to it all going into production, that would be very valuable, right? So we are seeing that shift taking place where the runtime knowledge and the expertise is kind of packaged and sent it back into the upstream process, right? So that's a good thing. And all of us in the industry need to kind of come together to do some of that. The business logic abuse is another interesting thing, right? Where, again, a lot of different examples in this space. And customers, often don't baseline things, right? Hey, and what we do when we look at these data elements, and at Akamai we have an advantage where we see all the good traffic, right? We see the good traffic, we see the bad traffic. So we have the ability to decipher that some of what is happening with these APIs is not looking right, right? Where just the sheer amount of transactions or the amount of account-related interactions, queries are taking place. There's something not right. There's a normal pattern, and then there is an abnormal pattern. We go figure that out. We deploy AI models and AI engines, to go figure all of that stuff out, right? The scientists, the data scientists are able to think about, what is viewed as the ground truth of the internet to what is then used as the sort of, abnormal aspect of it, right? And you saw how I kind of slipped in AI, right? That was kind of cool. Thank you. But it's important, right? Even for APIs, it's important. So let's hear to the customer.
Businesses today use APIs as the main technology to connect services and to transfer data. But not all the APIs are the same, and they are not protected in the same way. Web application firewall solutions have less insights to investigate the business logic and the data that is served by the APIs, because API attacks are not pattern-based. As we grow, there are more APIs, more integrations, and the next generation tool needs to understand the whole business logic around the API and the transfer of data for each API. So this is a new area that you need a really different approach and a really different solution.
So this was an example, of a SaaS company that provides HR-related services, right? And you're all kind of trusting that all of this data is going to reside, the information, the social security number, the payroll data, banking account information, all of that. It's kind of like a central repository in order to do the payroll, right? So again, all of those interactions are taking place via APIs, and securing, knowing everything that the SaaS provider has, and guarding and having a whole attack management and attack surface management capability is very, very important. So let's dive into some, 2 or 3 examples, right? So the first one is I talked about very briefly carding attacks, right? So what is a carding attack? So here, what we saw was, this is like an, entertainment television type of a company that was, basically B2C, right? Consumers. Consumers go and buy their services. So what we saw was this significantly increased traffic on the APIs that were sort of like ordering and validating the payment, right? So the bad guys figured out and say, okay, go through the steps. You go where you input the card is inputted, and then you authenticate that, right? When you're buying something, the business or the enterprise is going to authenticate if your credit card is valid or not. So it would do that. And what the bad guys were doing was they were not interested in buying television service or entertainment service or your favorite show. That's not what they were here for. They figured out over 2 or 3 days how to go validate tens of thousands of credit cards that were active or inactive. And by doing that, once they got the ones that were active, then that is valuable because now you can go buy something or you can sell it on the dark web, et cetera, right? So this was utilizing the APIs for this business to do a carding attack, get all of that data, and then utilize it for a different purpose. So, very smart, right? And then you had to get the regulators involved. Our threat teams got involved and showed the patterns on what information was going back and forth, how many of these were validated, et cetera, right? And it was probably the company, depending upon how things will turn out, but there might be some kind of a fee that they would have to pay because they were now part of a kind of more bigger abuse, right, that took place, or a fraud that took place. So again, nothing was lost from the company because they were not buying the television service, or they were not buying the streaming shows, or they were not buying the video on demand. They were just validating bad cards, good cards, right? So carding attacks, this is a common thing that we see, but the APIs, help with the speed of it, right? So what the bad guys could do in a day or 2 days, much faster than kind of doing certain other methodologies, right? So be careful. Keep all of this thing in mind. Let's do this one as a loyalty fraud in a commerce vertical. And I showed you earlier that commerce companies, enterprises were at the top of the surface over there when we did the bar chart. So here the example is that I'm a brick and mortar, and I have an online, and I'm retailing, and I'm in multiple businesses. I have a healthcare unit, I have a grocery unit, I'm providing some banking services, and I run loyalty points across the whole thing because I want you as my user customer to be kind of with me. And what we saw was that the bad guys kind of came in 5 different ways into 1 or 2 accounts, and they were able to get in. So first it was kind of like, how do I break through the API? Once they figured out, because I'm going back to my previous examples, is that if you hit it a certain way and if you keep querying back, it'll, be sending back the account number, then you take the name and the account number, and then you get some kind of other validation, boom, you got a penetration done. And so once they were in there, what they started to do was kind of shift a little bit by little bit by little bit, right? Which is okay, if most of us would not know if 10,000 points from our airline loyalty program were shifted, right? You're not monitoring all of that every day, right? In some cases, they were able to push out, almost $3,000, $5,000 worth of that, loyalty program points out. And then they consolidated all of that, and then they went and did something with it. Like they spent the money, they got the goods, they did the whole, penetration to consolidation to go get the value that they wanted to extract out of it, right? And we saw it was almost like $100,000 worth of fraud that was done, and we saw that, and we were able to kind of bring it forward to the customer, work with them, help. But again, going back to APIs that are available for the bad guys to do all of these things, and they did it, and loyalty programs, right? So go, hey, at the minimum, tonight, if you have a little coffee break or something, go check your airline, check your hotel points, do a baseline. And again, we live in a very digital world, right? I think my TD Ameritrade account is going to my Schwab account or something like that. And it's concerning, right? Because all of that is just going to happen electronically. There's nothing physical about it. So I'm just trusting. I'm trusting these companies. I'm trusting these brands to do the right thing, that Monday morning, the money, the account, all of that's going to show up. That is the world that we live in. We live in a hyper-connected digital economy that is powered by the APIs. And all of us are not watching every little thing every single day. So we need the cybersecurity professionals in these enterprises to think about it, right? So that is the main point over here. Here's another example. This was a API abuse in a SaaS notification service, right? So no authorization headers, the signatures inside the payloads were not checked, etc. And what was happening over here is that anyone with the access to the API could send notifications to the customers, right? So if you're running a notification services, you're like, got it penetrated, the bad guys are sending any notifications that they want, which is now creating a lot of chaos and logic. So it kind of hits the operations. It took the business down for a period of time. So it was more of a intrusive attack in this case. Last example. So potential BOLA attacks in an airline. So the whole idea with the BOLA attack was you have a broken object level of authorization, you penetrate that authorization, you can now have access to the data, you take the data out. Airlines have a lot of important information for all of us, right? So that was done in this example. We were able to trace it back, find it, work with the customers, et cetera. And again, businesses are doing the right thing when it comes to the APIs, right? So it's a fast way of communication. The data transfers are important, and now the bad guys are finding those same sort of loopholes and systems to get the data, extract the data, and utilize different methodologies. I talked about the OWASP top 10. The BOLA attacks are very prominent in that top 10, right? So go take a look at it. It's a very important area. I've also seen, kind of some of it related, but in the commerce space or airlines or others, is this places how the bad guys, you hear about like phishing sites and all that, right? So they just set up a fake site and they're pulling all the data from the real site. So it feels like, I remember there was an example in Asia Pac where, the bad guys put up the website for the airline, like a national, international airline, and sold probably millions of dollars worth of tickets. So when the people went to the day of travel, they had no ticket, but they thought they had the ticket. It was done with that level of precision. You set up a fake storefront, you set up a fake website, you pull all this information, and again, going back to the APIs, you can even go back into the airline and do the validation and authentication or provide the messaging back and forth that makes everything look so real to the users, right? And here you are, you gave your credit card, you gave your information, you booked the ticket, you're happy, you showed up for your vacation to Fiji, and you couldn't do anything, right? So very frustrating. But those are examples after examples after examples that we are starting to see in this space. So hopefully by now, we've convinced you that you cannot protect what you cannot see, and it's important, right? So again, it is very, very important going back to the visibility, the discovery, knowing the landscape, knowing what your APIs are doing, understanding how some of these things work, right? We all probably use the rideshare apps, Uber, Lyft, many of the other local ones, right? So you can imagine how all of those interactions are happening, user to app, app to the core to the network infrastructure, that to the mobile network, that to some kind of a financial transaction, right? Just imagine how connected we are in this economy and how many API transactions are happening. And why are API transactions popular? It's speed, right? It's fast. This is all like a industry protocol, and you have so many big name companies in this space, whether it is Apogee or Kong or MuleSoft or IBM, Microsoft, they all, AWS, they have all of these API management tools. They have API gateways, and a lot of data is traversing. We see all of that on Akamai, and that is why we are focused in this space. One of the things that we recently announced yesterday was the acquisition of, or the intent to acquire No Name Security, which is a prominent player in API security. We entered into API security last year and are further expanding and accelerating our efforts over here because we see real problems. We want to help customers every day, and it's a very strategic and important area. And that is why you see the passion in the examples that I shared, right? And what I believe and what my colleagues at Akamai believe is a very important space for us. So hopefully, you're taking some of that away: discovery, visibility, remediation. Now, remediation, there's a lot of different ways to go about it, right? Because typically, on a web application firewall, you could see the API traffic, but sometimes it's like authenticated traffic, so you really don't do anything with it, right? You say, okay, that's valid, so let it go. So that is why API security is a little bit different, where you have to monitor and look at what is happening and how is the interactions, the abuse, the behavioral part, building and figuring out what's happening internal, external, the type of transactions, etc., to apply API security. The WAF is a good way of doing some mitigation, but WAF by itself is not going to protect against all different types of API security related challenges, right? So keep that distinction in mind, and it's very important. On the remediation side, again, a lot of good ideas. I've seen customers come back and say, hey, can you kind of give me some integration back into ServiceNow, or can you give me integration back to my Jira system? Going back to different ways of shift left, right? Where you know what's happening in runtime, you know how to go fix it. Now tell me who and how I go do it. And with posture, tell me which ones are more important, because I don't have the time to go do everything, right? So keep those things in mind. So here we are. I'm coming to the end in a little bit, right? So we talk about 5 things, right? If you take away this sort of concept of a methodology, then you say, shine a light on the shadows. You got to know what you don't know. And there are tons of them, trust me. When we do discovery with our enterprise customers, we see tons of them. So first of all, you got to go figure out how many shadow APIs you have, what's going on, what are they doing, what is the purpose that they serve, who are the owners of those, etc. Right? So once you do that, discovering the shadow is very important, and then getting organized, because you have so many different departments, right? There is multiple application development departments. One could be related to sort of financial transactions. The other one could be related to compliance. The other one could be related to selling the products, buying the products. The other one could be related to doing a credit check. There's so many different interactions that are taking place. So organize all of them, so who's responsible for what and what do you do with it. So once you identify, you get it organized, you do your inventory, you put it all together, and then let's start hardening the posture, right? Because again, you cannot solve everything in one day, so you will have to decide what are more important. What are my most important host names? What is the most important APIs that are supporting my most important applications? Once you figure that out, go get the work going on. You go figure out, hey, this is my priority. I'm going to go harden my posture. And it takes time because it's work involved, right? But at least you know where you need to focus on. And I run a engineering department too, along with my product responsibility. And I, as an engineering leader, face the same problem. I get a spreadsheet with 3,000 vulnerabilities. I send the email to my VPs and say, go fix them. They say, yes, Rupesh, we got it. A week later, I said, how many did you fix? It says, I don't know where to start, right? So I'm sure all of us are facing that problem, right? When you have such a large set of information coming, how do you prioritize? So posture, extremely important, right? The sort of sharpening the threat aspects is the 4th one, which is really you get into the whole detection and response and finding all of it. And some of it is very obvious when we are doing proof of concepts with customers. We're able to see it very quickly. Some of it takes time. Some of it takes some threat hunting. Some of it you have to have some knowledge over a period of time, right? So these things become very important when it comes to detections. And the detections require a lot of intelligence. So one of the things that we do is we have this concept of, client reputation. So we keep, we know which ones are the bad IPs. and anything associated with those bad IPs, we're able to figure out, okay, are those being utilized to attack these APIs, right? So sometimes, because we know who the adversaries are, because we have visibility of the internet traffic, we are able to know good traffic, bad traffic, and how to go about it, right? So detection, extremely important. And then you have the response. You will have to make a choice. Do you do something? You don't do something, right? Can you imagine in a world where we're going to be all, smart cities and autonomous cars, right? I would love to be, there's a lot of cars that are going around over here in San Francisco. I haven't sat in one yet because I know about all the API issues, right? But can you imagine, right, that, there's all these fast transactions happening, some abuse is taking place, and, you can't control, right? You cannot control that device, that machine, that car, that plane, that street light. Just imagine what it can do. There was a big movement in America, I remember in 2017-18, with the advent of the 5G networks that, will have smart cities and all of that, right? Well, everything in the city is going to be smart and connected, and stuff's going to be like highly automated. And then the pandemic hit, and then ransomware hit. And now everybody's like, better to be like low tech than high tech, right? My school district, where my kids go, got ransomware like literally like every year. And they get it for that same amount of $50,000. Now the school district doesn't have, IT staff, doesn't have a CISO, doesn't have the cybersecurity experts, et cetera. But they bought insurance. They bought cybersecurity insurance. But the bad guys knew that the insurance was $50,000. So the school board would approve paying the $50,000. And they would do it every year, right? So what the bad guys did was they first went and, broke into the security company to know who has how much insurance. And then they systematically attacked the agencies that would pay them that money, right? So such an organized way of going about it. So response is very important. How are you going to respond? What are decisions you're going to make? Are you going to block all traffic? Are you going to let some of it in? Are you going to create defense in depth? Are you going to create layers of it? What are you going to do? Very, very important, right? So detection and response. And the last point, which is, again, extremely important if you think about these five, is sort of, developing a stronger offense, right? So you start thinking about, again, a little bit about shift left, and how do I become more on the offense side? What do I do to make sure that I'm not falling into some of those same traps, right? The Bola attacks that I talked about, or this carding attack. Like, what can I safeguard against some of these known things? And I'm glad we are all here at RSA. We're all here to learn about that, right? We're here to learn about cloud security, or AI security, or API security, network security, et cetera, right? And the importance is constantly thinking about a stronger offense in this space, right? We have the SOTI report available, as I mentioned, 10 years, right? So round of applause for all the researchers that have spent time, but we are going to continue to publish that, lurking in the shadows. A lot of it is focused on API, et cetera. And that brings me to my thank you slide. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. We'll open it up for some Q&A. So we have some microphones, so please use those because it's part of the recording. Hopefully it was insightful. Hopefully the choice that you made to spend the time with me instead of the sleeping in or the coffee. So I appreciate it. But I'll take questions. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for sharing such an insightful piece on the APIs. Question on if you have some insights around, most of the examples that you quoted were around B2C type, where the consumer was probably the impacted. Anything to do with B2B that you have, you could share? For example, APIs pulling config information out, and therefore making it relevant for threat actors to, compromise. Right.
No, that's a great question and a great point. We've seen B2B also, and I started to talk a little bit about the API gateways and how. So there's a lot of traffic that traverses into the B2B examples. I've seen a lot of it in the financial services. That is where we see the most, where a lot of back-end applications are talking with each other, and the bad guys are coming in. Either they are doing some kind of the abuse, associated with some kind of an operational challenge. So I'll have to think about something very specific, but I do see that over there for sure. But it's a great question, great example. But also internal. We see a ton of internal, right? You take a look at a big enterprise and you have a lot of internal applications not going out of your DMZs, yet they are interacting with APIs, and those then become sort of the threat landscape. So B2C or user to web, B2B, and then internal applications. Thank you. Any other questions? Any other comments, thoughts?
Hi. Thank you for your presentations. I'm Yusuke from Magrica. So I'm very surprised about the acquisition for NoName. So you have already API security of the Neosec. So why you acquire NoName? So I want to know your product strategies.
Sure. So I'll repeat the question. The point was that a year ago, we acquired a startup called Neosec in the API security space. Yesterday, we announced the intent to acquire NoName, who is also in the API security space. And what is our product strategy, right? So the idea is that we are, again, hopefully you picked up from my presentation, it's very, very important for Akamai to invest and expand in the API security space. And this is the intent to acquire NoName. Is the strategy is about expanding and accelerating in that space. So we have a set of capabilities. NoName has a set of capabilities. We're going to build a better together product strategy. We're going to lead with some of the advantages that NoName already has in terms of on-prem, flexible deployment, lots of different integrations, et cetera. We'll build out some native connectors for the Akamai traffic. We'll share threat intelligence. So we have an internal roadmap and a strategy. But again, we are not just double down, we're triple down in this space because we see that much importance. We see that much abuse, exposure, vulnerabilities that our customers are experiencing. So we are excited, super excited, by the way. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? All right, very good. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.